Hello, and welcome back to Podfinder. This is, finally, Day 12 of the 12 Days of Sinmas. And, if you don't know what that means, pause this video and check out the playlist I've linked in the description. The Prelude video explains everything. Today, I am finally looking at the last of the 7 sins of Thassilonian magic, and the last of the Runelords of the Empire, Sorshen, Runelord of Lust. For all my assertions throughout this series that Xandergul was the most powerful of the Runelords, I actually think Sorshen might be more dangerous. Her mastery of enchantment magic allowed her to maintain her grip on power for nearly 1,200 years, and never once was her rule meaningfully challenged. Sorshen was also the one to discover the secrets of the legendary rune wells, which would go on to change the course of Thassilonian history forever. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. And, before I forget, check out the timeline I put together of Thassilon's history. If you're a visual person, it will really help you get a hold of the history of Xin and the Runelords who would take over his empire. Link in the description. And before we continue, first things first. Content warning. This video discusses the sin of lust and the magical school of enchantment, which is the arcane art of directly manipulating or controlling the mind. As you can imagine, at the intersection of lust and enchantment are some extremely unsavory topics, not fit for discussion at most tables. Thankfully, I have found no explicit mention of SA on the part of the main character of today's video. As such, I will not be discussing the subject. That said, the potential for such topics is certainly present in the subtext of this discussion, so if that makes you uncomfortable or uneasy, I suggest you skip this video. And, with that out of the way, let's dig in. The sin of lust was a corruption of the virtue of love, and was associated with the School of Enchantment. Rune magic users who cast enchantment spells felt a surge of emotion similar to the experience of being someone's whole world. They felt joy in their hearts, which they associated with the adoration of others. Those who practiced the virtue of love recognized this as a sensation which all should be free to experience, and sought to share the feeling with others freely and without condition. Those who followed the teachings of lust, however, saw this adoration as a feeling they could induce in others through manipulation, seduction, and enticement. They sought to monopolize the attention and affections of others, so they might always feel desired and adored. The School of Enchantment. The School of Enchantment contains spells which directly manipulate the mind. They tug on emotions like the strings of a marionette, and grant a master enchanter a level of control over their subjects which other spellcasters could only dream of attaining. The scale of enchantment spells ranges from soothing phrases whispered in the ear of a frightened child to single words which can induce such emotional trauma that they render their targets dead on the spot. Skilled enchanters can leave their targets haunted by fits of madness or writhing in agony, but can just as easily leave targets with no knowledge that any spell was ever cast. Before we go any further, though, I do want to clarify that enchantment is probably the most dangerous and insidious of the 8 schools of magic. Enchantment spells override the free will of their targets, and in some cases even supersede their bodily autonomy. Even simple spells like Charm could serve incredibly dangerous purposes if used by bad actors. While things like mind tricks and forgetfulness charms are useful and even fun tools for storytelling, they can have incredibly dark implications or consequences if not handled with care. For all the GMs and players out there, be sure to understand your tablemate's level of comfort with these topics before you go throwing them into your story. Enchantment doesn't really have clear subdivisions like some of the other schools I've discussed. Subschools exist within the mechanics of the game, but they don't have much narrative distinction. For our purposes, I'll instead be discussing enchantments by looking at their scale, and the relative subtlety with which they are, or at least can be, applied. On the subtle end of things are small, single-target enchantment spells like Charm, which reach into a target's mind and gently entice them into a better and more accepting mood. These spells can be put to wide use in day-to-day life to great effect. Thieves could use them to gain access to guarded locations, but heroic figures might also use them to de-escalate conflicts. Scaling up a bit, spells like Calm Emotions, Sleep, or the ever-popular Fear are a bit less subtle in what they can achieve, but target a larger number of creatures and produce more substantial emotional responses. Similarly, Soothe can induce such calming effects that the target's physical injuries actually begin to heal. Even further up the scale are spells like Agonizing Despair, which can induce such mental anguish that the damage they cause can be lethal. Spells like Paralyze can render targets entirely hopeless, while Heroism can encourage a target to the extent that their actual physical abilities are improved. On the highest end of the spectrum are spells like Dominate, which can wrest control of the target's mind and body completely, rendering them entirely subservient to the whims of the caster. Overwhelming Presence can induce such awe in the targets that they simply fall down in awe, while the power word spells, Blind, Stun, and Kill, induce instantaneous physical maladies or even death upon their targets. Enchantment spells can accomplish all manner of effects, from buffing allies to debuffing enemies to discerning secrets to directly damaging foes. For all its strengths, though, the school does have its weaknesses. Like illusions, but to an even greater extent, enchantment spells are dependent upon targets who are not mindless. Against mindless opponents, many of an enchanter's greatest tools are effectively useless, and they must often resort to aiding allies who can deal directly with a mindless threat. There is also a narrative danger associated with enchantment. Enchanters are known to become callous regarding the emotions of others. They tend to treat emotions like just another tool to be manipulated, rather than something core to the experience of mortal life. They run the risk of seeing themselves and those around them with a clinical eye, and minimizing the feelings of themselves and their targets as a result. Known enchanters are also commonly treated with fear and disdain by local populations, who fear that the enchanter can never be trusted and always has an ulterior motive. Under the practices of rune magic, enchanters were incapable of casting spells from the schools of transmutation or necromancy. This left them without the incredibly useful healing spells which necromancy offered, and left them with little means of resurrecting themselves or their allies upon death. They also lacked the ability to transform themselves or their allies into the physical monstrosities so common on the battlefield, and so had to rely on their own innate battlefield prowess, or had to enlist the aid of creatures who were already powerful on their own. Luckily, a skilled enchanter would find this process of enlistment all too easy. It's also worth mentioning that enchanters were most effective when they could combine their spellcasting with a strong force of personality. This led to many great enchanters who were well-spoken, and who understood the finer points of social interaction. Most of them could be charming, terrifying, and captivating all on their own, even without the aid of spells. The Rune of Enchantment was well recognized throughout the Empire, and Runelord Sorshen even went so far as to inscribe it as a tattoo on her body, as part of her Rune of the Mistress. That being said, I haven't found any descriptions of how the Rune of Enchantment was interpreted visually. Unlike many of the other runes, it doesn't really seem to represent anything. The Runelord of Lust. The first and only Runelord of Lust was, and still is, Sorshen, who, much like Xandergul, was given the title of Runelord by First King Zin in -6480, and ruled for 1,187 years until the Earthfall calamity finally cut her reign short. Sorshen was a renowned scholar and spellcaster, and was one of only 3 Runelords to have achieved mythic status during the Thassilonian period. Beyond her academic and arcane skill, she was a brilliant politician, a master manipulator, and an accomplished head of state. It was Sorshen who stepped in and finally convinced Zin to hand over the reins of power to his 7 apprentices, when Xandergul's initial pleas were poorly received. Though her origins are unclear, she is known to have followed Zin into exile from Aslant, where she was likely a noble, though her precise station is unknown. What is universally agreed upon, however, is her mastery over enchantment magic, which was unparalleled during her reign, and has yet to be surpassed in the Age of Lost Omens. Though not the most powerful of the Runelords at the time of Thassilon's founding, Sorshen quickly climbed in the ranks and established herself as a force to be reckoned with on the world stage. That Xandergul, a living god, would consider her a rival is a testament to her power and cleverness. As the first Runelord of Lust, or Love at the time, Sorshen was the recipient of the Alarakin of Love from the first king Zin. Unlike many of the weapons of rule, the source of the consciousness for this particular Alarakin has been confirmed. Sorshen took an active role in the creation of her weapon, and offered Zin a gemstone, into which she had placed 13 of her most twisted carnal fantasies, which she had extracted directly from her mind. This gemstone would serve as the basis for the weapon's innate personality. Why Zin would agree to this is unclear to me, since he specifically intended for these weapons to serve as companions to his supposedly righteous and benevolent apprentices. I suspect this might have been one of those details which was established early on in the development of the lore, before Zin's good intentions were a known quantity. Alternatively, Sorshen may have convinced Zin that this could have excised the lust from within her, and made her better able to practice the virtue of love. Regardless, this is the only Alarakin which I can confirm was partially designed by its intended wielder, which might be indicative of the level of influence Sorshen held over her master. Mechanically, Sorshen's sinuous geese arm, as it was eventually known, is among the most powerful of the weapons of rule, though it is likely that Sorshen herself increased the weapon's power gradually over her long reign. It is a +5 keen, speed, spell-storing mithril geese arm, with the unique ability to bestow upon its wielder a passive +2 bonus on saving throws, skill checks, and attack rolls. The weapon can also cast several innate spells, including Suggestion, Mirror Image, and 1E's Charm Monster, which is likely equivalent to a 2E 4th rank charm spell. As if all that wasn't enough, the weapon could be transformed on command into a Staff of Enchantment, likely equivalent to a major Staff of Control in the post-remaster era. This staff form took on a suggestive appearance, according to some sources. I've also seen mention of the weapon having an ability to summon a pair of powerful but attractive bodyguards, though this ability seems to have been dropped from later descriptions. One odd design element of the sinuous geese arm is the second blade affixed to the bottom of the weapon. This second blade is the physical representation of the weapon's speed property, as the extra attack granted by that ability was always made with the secondary blade. The weapon automatically imbued its wielder with the grace necessary to wield the secondary weapon effectively, and no special training was required beyond the ability to proficiently wield a geese arm. Upon being appointed to the position of Runelord, Sorshen took up the management of Eurythnia, the southernmost of the Thassilonian member states. Eurythnia was a nation with fertile farmlands well suited to the growing of spices and herbs, and the abundance of navigable rivers made the transportation of these goods relatively easy. Beyond this, Eurythnia commanded a long coastline, which was relatively easy to sail and navigate. This allowed the nation to establish itself as an economic powerhouse, drawing in wealth from all around the world as a major exporter of spices and luxurious foodstuffs. Of course, Eurythnia was also the nation of lust, and this sinful corruption also rose to prominence economically. Eurythnia was known the world over for its brothels, which were second to none. These establishments prided themselves on their extravagance and the quality and variety of their living wares. They were well known to acquire workers from the farthest reaches of the known world and beyond. They were especially known for the elves which they employed. Of course, I say employed, but I have no evidence one way or another about the level of coercion present in these institutions. I assume it wasn't a good situation, given Thassilon's broader reputation, but that's just an educated guess on my part. Eurythnia was populated primarily by humans, like much of Thassilon, but the larger cities drew members of nearly all ancestries as both visitors and residents. Little has been detailed about the non-human inhabitants of the land, except that marsh giants were regularly employed to protect the valuable shipping lanes along the coasts and rivers from pirates and Sawajin. As her capital, Sorshen established the city of Zin Eurythnia, a metropolis which commanded trade on the eastern half of her kingdom. This city was located on the shores of a lake which connected to the coast via a short stretch of river, and that same river ran up into the mountains to the east. Defended by mountains in one direction and the lake in the other, Zin Eurythnia was fairly defensible, but was far from the military stronghold that some of the other Thassilonian capitals became. As her seat of power, Sorshen ordered the construction of the Grand Mastaba, a flat-topped sandstone pyramid of impressive proportions. The base of the pyramid measured between 400 and 500 feet long on each side, making it slightly larger than the Pyramid of Menkaure at Giza. This structure served as Sorshen's palace, but also contained many catacombs and hollow chambers within, which served as Sorshen's living quarters, laboratories, and treasure chambers. The Grand Mastaba can still be seen in the Age of Lost Omens, and Castle Corvosa has been constructed upon the pyramid's flat top. Zin Eurythnia also played host to a number of other monuments and constructions of note. A grand processional ran along the southern edge of the city, supported by a series of 100-foot-tall marble pillars, which formed a sort of wall. This processional terminated on its west end at a towering statue of Sorshen, which could be seen for miles in all directions. Sorshen constructed this statue in place of the massive face carvings which the other Runelords favored. She preferred that her subjects see her entire magnificent body, rather than just her face. This statue supposedly depicted Sorshen in the nude, and this was far from the only construction which did so throughout Eurythnia. An accurate height for the statue has not been provided by Paizo, though it likely stood at least 200 feet high, based on the similarities between it and the Lady's Light as depicted on the map of ancient Thassilon. That said, looking at the map of Corvosa from Curse of the Crimson Throne, and estimating the length of the foot of the statue to be about 100 feet long, I calculate that the statue could have stood up to 660 feet high. But enough about her nation. What about Sorshen herself? To many of the peoples of Thassilon, Sorshen was defined almost exclusively by her appearance. At the risk of sounding a little base, Sorshen was a 10 out of 10 baddie, an absolute smoke show who was among the most beautiful women in the world. Her straight dark hair was long and voluminous. Her deep green eyes were large and expressive. Her curvaceous figure was perfectly shaped, as though it had been lovingly formed by Shellen herself. Normally, I wouldn't feel particularly comfortable about lingering on the carnal appeal of a female character like this, but in this case it feels necessary, since this is how Sorshen herself wanted to be seen. To Sorshen, seductiveness was a weapon, and she was unrivaled in the skill with which she wielded it. Her face, already beautiful, nearly always wore a seductive expression. Her body, a vision of physical perfection, was draped in soft fabrics of scandalous cuts and salacious design. She controlled her voice with precision, tuning it with ease into a seductive purr with which she could melt even the most stalwart of mental or emotional defenses. Now, I should clarify that while Sorshen was a master of wielding the art of seduction as a weapon, the precision with which she wielded it varied wildly over the course of her reign. At earlier points in her career, she basically employed all the subtlety of a warhammer. She dressed in only the most revealing clothes, and made no secret of her insatiable carnal appetites. As her reign continued, however, she soon took a more subdued approach to her lustful pursuits and displays. She adopted a more conservative, though no less beautiful, form of dress, and began to wield her seductive powers more like a carefully placed dagger. This largely mirrors her approach to politics. Early on in her reign, Sorshen was extremely active on the world stage, attaining mythic power, discovering and sharing the secrets of the rune wells, and forging her sword of sin. As time ran on, however, she slowly stepped back from the international stage. She surmised that the best approach to ensure her continued power was not to challenge her fellow Runelords directly, but instead to manipulate from the shadows, pitting her enemies against one another and allowing agents, witting or otherwise, to do her bidding. She constantly spied on the conflicts between Alasnist and Karzug, for example, and always knew the goings-on at the Eyerspan. I did find one source which claimed that Sorshen actively seduced and betrayed each of the 39 Runelords who ever ruled in Thassilon, but I find this claim to be dubious at best. This contradicts much of Sorshen's established personality, and besides that would have been both logistically difficult and politically risky. I suspect that this information, if it is still canon at all, was merely a widely circulated rumor in Thassilon, and might have even been started by Sorshen herself, as a ploy to ensure that her rival archwizards treated her with an appropriate level of fear and respect. One piece of information which I don't consider contested at all is Sorshen's dominant personality. In interpersonal interactions, especially within the borders of her own kingdom, there was never any question that Sorshen was in complete control of the world around her. Other people acted because she allowed them to act. If they spoke, it was because she chose to allow them to continue speaking. If they approached her, it was because she wanted to be close to them, not the other way around. Those seeking an audience with her typically needed to present themselves in a defenseless state for her inspection, either in a position of prostration or completely disarmed, and often naked. She commonly employed wards which compelled those intruding upon her spaces to disrobe and present themselves to her in supplication. In fact, nakedness is an extremely common theme throughout Sorshen's story. Much like seduction and enchantment, nakedness was another weapon which Sorshen wielded with expertise. She commonly presented herself in the nude, even in formal or official settings, and saw no shame in it. Instead, she used her own nakedness as a statement. She was comfortable with her body and in displaying it for the world to see, and indulging in her own nudity gave her a sense of power. She needed no clothes, no armor, no coverings of any kind to defend herself, or assert her authority. She alone was enough, without decoration. Conversely, the same could not be said of her subjects. Their nakedness was a thing forced upon them by Sorshen, and even in situations where she too was unclothed, they could not hope to measure up to her physical perfection. Those forced to present themselves unclothed before her lacked any form of physical defense or protection, which was particularly ironic, considering her most common attacks targeted the mind, and would have completely bypassed such defenses anyway. One other consistent feature of Sorshen's personality is her capriciousness. Especially in her earlier years, the Runelord of Lust was particularly mercurial, and her moods tended to shift rapidly and without warning. She demonstrated incredible passion for whatever caught her eye, but, at least in personal interactions, also tended to grow bored easily. There was almost a degree of whimsy to the way in which she carried herself, which could be extremely dangerous in the hands of someone who could casually take over a person's mind with a gesture. On a lighter note, Sorshen is known to have had a special fondness for perfumes. While she was known to have used perfumes on several occasions to make poisons or other vaporous traps, she also simply liked perfume for its mundane purpose. One famous perfume commonly used in Thassilon was even named for her. Sorshen's Whisper, as the perfume was called, was made using the petals of the black spider orchid, the pollen of the crypt flower, dried honeysuckle, golden ambergris, and ground ember cloves, all mixed carefully with purified water. Such was Sorshen's love for perfumes that she even developed a method of imbuing the concoctions with magical power, so they might function as potions. Mechanically speaking, Sorshen was an absolute powerhouse. At the height of her power, she was a 20th level wizard, with 10 tiers of mythic power under the 1E mythic rules. In addition to being equipped with, quite literally, the best equipment money could buy, Sorshen had augmented her ability scores with wish spells, and she used embedded emerald ellipsoid aeon stones to give her an additional 100 hit points. Her exposure to the Everdawn Pool artifact, which I will discuss in a minute, had made her immortal, rendering her immune to disease and all forms of madness, as well as bleed effects. She also calculated her hit points using her charisma as a base stat, rather than her constitution, again due to the influence of the Everdawn Pool. Her most favored spells were Dominate and Overwhelming Presence, which she could cast with a save DC of 38, which was extraordinarily high for 1E. It's worth noting that she also had access to her Rune of the Mistress, which could impose a -4 penalty on saves against enchantments. She also employed spells like Contagious Insanity and Teleport, and always had a wish spell prepared for emergencies. Sorshen's Aesthetic Sensibilities. While this information might seem a bit extraneous, I think it goes a long way toward demonstrating what a larger-than-life character Sorshen is, so I hope you'll indulge me for a moment. Sorshen appreciated beauty in all its forms, and was more than willing to cover the expenses necessary to ensure that her surroundings were to her liking. For example, at the base of the Lady's Light statue, which I'll discuss in a bit more detail later, Sorshen constructed a series of marvelous crystal pillars throughout a room which also contained multiple large waterfalls. These served no purpose beyond their innate beauty, and yet Sorshen saw them as worth her effort. In rooms which were not intended to have a more natural appearance, Sorshen gravitated toward black marble and gold as her preferred materials. The brightness and reflectivity of the polished gold contrasted nicely with the black marble, and served to bring out the strata running through the rock. To accent these bold materials, Sorshen used only the finest and most expensive decorations: thick and richly woven rugs, tapestries of impeccable craftsmanship, and mosaics of intricate design. Many of the pillars and statuary throughout Sorshen's buildings depicted nude figures, and most commonly Sorshen herself, in various suggestive or sometimes outright explicit positions. In addition to satisfying Sorshen's need to display herself or representations of lust, these statues also served as excellent hiding places for Thassilonian sentinels, the small head-shaped constructs I discussed near the beginning of this series. And, of course, I couldn't discuss Sorshen's sense of taste without mentioning her fascination with paintings. More than any other detail in the large spaces constructed by Sorshen, the enormous murals and frescoes stand out as being of particular significance. These sometimes depicted innocent things, like a moonless night sky filled with bright stars. More commonly, these paintings depicted Sorshen herself in positions of power, ruling over her adoring citizens or issuing commands from her throne or palace. Most frequently, however, were depictions of orgiastic, lascivious excess, involving beings of all genders and ancestries. Sorshen herself could sometimes be seen within these works, indulging in her darkest passions and caught up in the throes of ecstasy. But, just as often, these paintings omitted her entirely, and instead focused solely on the depiction of lustful indulgence in general. Sorshen once favored a specific painter, a man named Amavadius Yazrin. Amavadius was not above painting the topics his mistress commanded, but saw within her and her nation the slowly growing rot of corruption and debauchery. He subtly added these elements into his paintings, ensuring that those who saw the sin of lust for what it truly was could identify his opinion on the matter. The inclusion of these details into his works might have been what caused Sorshen to ultimately kill him, despite her fondness for his work. The Early Discoveries of Sorshen. In -6479 AR, only a year after attaining the position of Runelord, Sorshen was traveling the mountainous northern countryside of Eurythnia when she stumbled upon something incredible. A 30-foot diameter sphere of swirling, boiling blood, floating a few feet above the ground. Though unaware of the artifact's origins, Sorshen quickly surmised that it was not some freak natural phenomenon. This device, whatever it was, had been constructed by sentient beings. Though she would never be able to confirm the original creators, her suspicions eventually fell upon the Scarlet Walkers, the enormous and dangerous blood-colored arachnids native to the nightmare realm of Leng. Regardless of the artifact's origins, Sorshen quickly realized that it was brimming with incredible power. She chose to keep the existence of the pool a secret from her fellow Runelords, and, to prevent its discovery by one of her neighbors, she commissioned the construction of a temple nearby to hide it. This would become the Shining Queen, a pyramid with a carved depiction of Sorshen's nude form on one side, which would go on to serve as one of Sorshen's most important research facilities. Sorshen moved the mass of blood into the Shining Queen's uppermost floor, and there she gave it a name: the Everdawn Pool. From there, the Runelord of Lust began her magical research. I mentioned it briefly earlier, but Sorshen really was an unbelievably accomplished scholar and researcher. Her mastery of the arcane arts was nearly unparalleled in her time, and she is among the most learned magical scholars in all of Golarion's history. Only characters like Baba Yaga, Old Mage Jitembe, and Tar-Baphon have a better understanding of magic, at least outside of the gods themselves. This is best demonstrated by the way in which Sorshen quickly unraveled and broke down the many magical abilities which the Everdawn Pool possessed. The Everdawn Pool proved to be a tremendously powerful artifact indeed, and it possessed a wide array of useful abilities which Sorshen was able to use to aid in her rise to power. The artifact required a drop of blood to be added as part of a half-day-long ritual before it could be charged. The pool could hold up to 25 charges, but only one drop of blood could be added at a time, so it was slow to fill. Only high-level spellcasters with access to at least 9th rank spells could even charge the pool to begin with. After the Everdawn Pool had been charged, the user must absorb a portion of its power, by submerging themselves within it for at least 10 minutes. Once they'd absorbed that power, however, they gained access to the artifact's full suite of abilities. So long as the user was submerged within the pool, they could expend 2 charges to create a blood simulacrum of themselves, and up to 7 of such simulacra could be active at any one time. One blood simulacra of the user's choice is even subject to a redirection effect, allowing them to become the target of any scrying effect intended to target the user. The user could also expend 20 charges to cast a wish spell for free, though this wish is limited to replicating the effects of any 9th rank or lower spell. Sorshen herself often made use of this ability to cast high-ranking spells of her opposition schools, necromancy and transmutation, though she typically limited this to when she needed spells more powerful than her many mind-controlled transmuter and necromancer servants could cast on their own. Finally, the user of the Everdawn Pool could expend 5 charges to have the pool create a powerful living servant. The form of this servant is somewhat dependent on the soul and personality of the user, but mechanically it can be as powerful as up to 3 levels below the user themselves. By far the most impactful ability of the Everdawn Pool, however, was its ability to confer eternal youth upon its owner. This ability was the most insidious and outright evil among the tools the pool had to offer, as it required the sacrifice of living victims. First, the user needed to gather the blood samples of numerous mortals, which would then be added to the Everdawn Pool. The user could then bathe within the pool and absorb its power, consuming 1 charge. After 100 charges were consumed in this manner within a single calendar year, the user would be infused with life energy, and granted a 1-year extension on youthfulness and life for each of the mortals whose blood had been collected. These life energies were drawn directly from those mortals, and those victims immediately dropped dead as soon as the ritual was complete. This ability does not allow a saving throw to the victims, making it a potentially powerful weapon if used offensively, though I can find no records of such a use case ever having been performed. I cannot emphasize enough just how important this particular ability was. Beyond the obvious use case of allowing Sorshen to remain young forever, it was this ability, the collection of life energy from multiple sources, and the channeling of that energy into a single centralized location so it could be channeled into a specific purpose, that laid the groundwork for a revolution in the understanding and application of Thassilonian rune magic. Sorshen was not content to use the powers of the Everdawn Pool as they existed. She sought to take the mechanics of the device and apply them to a new purpose. She began experimenting with the absorption of sin energy, the inherent metaphysical malevolence which all mortals give off when they engage in sinful behavior. This was the power which fueled the Runelords' corrupted version of rune magic, and could be far more easily controlled and manipulated than life energy. If sin energy could be absorbed from multiple sources, then channeled into a Runelord so they could put it to use, it would present them with a near limitless source of power to fuel their magical experimentation. You can probably see where this is going. In minus 6452, Sorshen succeeded in her efforts, and created the first Rune Well, a pool of magical energy which manifested as a liquid which could absorb the latent sin energy in its immediate vicinity, and gather it like a battery being charged. Sorshen could then use these charges, sometimes called sin points, to activate various magical effects. The creation of the first Runelord of Lust, or at least the research which led up to it, propelled Sorshen to mythic status. I should clarify, however, that I'm not entirely certain which type of Runewell was created first, meaning a major Runelord of Lust or a minor Runelord of Lust. I suspect it was probably the major, since that is more worthy of being listed in the official Thassilonian Timeline in Return of the Runelords, but I can't say for certain. At this point in history, the Runelords still broadly considered themselves aligned, if a bit competitive. Xin was still alive, and all the Runelords considered him a threat to their eventual ascension to power. As a show of good faith, Sorshen chose to share the secret of the Runewells with her fellow Runelords, allowing them to eventually develop versions aligned to their own sins. Unfortunately, this decision was one which Sorshen would soon come to sorely regret. So I've talked about the Runewells quite a bit throughout this series, but what specifically can they do? What exactly is their primary purpose? Runewells, both minor and major, served as self-charging arcane batteries of power, and specifically sin energy. Runewells could absorb the latent sin energy of sinful souls who died within a set distance of the Runewell. For minor Runewells, this distance was about a mile. For major Runewells, the distance was larger, but I haven't been able to pin down an exact number. Certain artifacts, like Karzug's Soul Lens, could be used to extend this distance substantially, but these were separate magical constructions, and were not consistently employed. Once sin energy was collected, it could then be channeled into specific effects, which I will detail in a moment. While all the Runelords who created a Runewell only ever produced a single major Runewell each, it's implied that they all produced multiple minor Runewells of their particular sin. Minor Runewells were exactly what they sounded like, smaller and weaker versions of the major Runewell, which functioned similarly but with a more limited power set. All Runewells attuned to a specific sin were connected to a sort of Runewell network, which allowed surges of power to flow between them. I know for a fact that the major Runewell could transfer some of its power to the minor Runewells within its network, but I don't know for sure if the power could go the other direction. I suspect it probably could, but I don't have any evidence of that. Minor Runewells had two primary functions: the imbuing of sin energy into a living creature, and the creation of the sin spawn. If a minor Runewell was active, a living being could be partially submerged within its waters. They would then be subjected to a small amount of damage, and would be forced to make a will save. If the being failed this save, they would then become filled with the essence of that Runewell's attuned sin for a short time. A minor Runewell of Wrath, for instance, would cause a person to become enraged per the rage spell for 2d6 minutes, during which time they would be compelled to find people to attack and kill. The more significant function of a minor Runewell, however, was the creation of the sin spawn. I discussed the sin spawn already in my video on Elasnist, but as a brief reminder, they were synthetically created living beings who were infused at the genetic level with the essence of a specific sin. In addition to creating the sin spawn, the minor Runewells could also sustain these creatures without the need for food or water. If the Runewell ever went dormant, any sin spawn sustained by it would simply drop into a coma, where they would exist in stasis until the Runewell was reactivated. Interestingly, it's worth noting that the minor Runewells could be created without the creation of a major Runewell first. This is proven by the fact that all 7 variants of the sin spawn exist, but not all Runelords managed the creation of a major Runewell. As a minor point of clarification, I suspect that the minor Runewells also had other functions, which have simply been lost to time since the collapse of Thassilon. I don't have a lot of evidence to back this up, but it just feels right to me. Major Runewells were substantially more powerful than their minor siblings. I assume they could perform all the functions of the minor rune wells, though I can't find any evidence of this. The major rune wells had access to several more powerful effects, however. First, they allowed the creator to scry on any location within a several-mile radius of the rune well's physical location, as well as the immediate vicinity of agents who had been exposed to the rune well's energies. A major rune well was also connected to any of the Sihedron medallions which its master had created. This connection could be activated through the rune well to allow the master to see through the eyes of anyone who wore the medallions, as well as speak through their mouth. This information would have been really nice to know during my playthrough of Rise of the Runelords, but it's fine. I'm not mad. It's not like my Magus wore that medallion for literally the entire campaign or anything. Anyway, the major runewells also had additional powers unique to their specific sins. These varied from runewell to runewell, so unfortunately we only have one example. Karzug's major runewell of greed possessed the power to create an adult blue dragon, which would serve him loyally as either a guardian or mount. Notably, this was not a summoned creature. The runewell was capable of creating a fully sentient being. This appears to be an evolution of the similar power demonstrated by the Everdawn pool. And again, I'm not mad, but my GM decided that an adult blue dragon wasn't strong enough, so we walked into the final boss fight and saw Karzug defended by a friggin' great Wyrm. But it's fine. It's not like that was a serious problem. The most significant power of a major runewell, however, was by far the ability to create a time-isolated demiplane into which the runewell's master could flee. These demiplanes were relatively small pocket dimensions, located outside of the material plane. They were limited to 100 or so feet in diameter, and took on an appearance vaguely reflective of the sin to which the runewell was attuned when the plane was created. These demiplanes were both temporally and physically disconnected from the material plane, and so their inhabitants were not subject to things like aging or the passage of time in the same way. That said, most Runelords were functionally immortal anyway, so this wasn't as critical as it might have originally seemed. The inhabitants of these demiplanes were completely cut off from the outside world, and had no way of interacting with it unless special precautions were taken. In the case of Karzug and Alasnist, these precautions took the form of a device called an anima focus, a device which looked a lot like a runewell, but which functioned as an anchor to tether the demiplane to reality. This anima focus could collect and channel sin energy directly into the runewell, which was itself trapped within the demiplane it created. Once the runewell absorbed enough energy, it would reopen the portal to the material plane, and allow its inhabitants to walk free. Before I close out my discussion of runewells, I should mention the possible connection they have to the primordial spark present within the true giants of Golarion. I mentioned this in my discussion of the Rune Giants, but the true giants of Golarion all bear a magical connection to their primordial ancestors, the Titans. These were mysterious beings who rebelled against the gods in the Age of Creation, and whose power lives on in their descendants. According to the original printing of Rise of the Runelords, this primordial connection was discovered by the Runelords during their creation of the Rune Giants. And this discovery contributed in some unspecified way to Sorshen's creation of the runewells. This information may no longer be canon, it's kind of hard to say. Getting back to Sorshen's story, the Runelord of Lust wasn't about to stop after her ascension to mythic power and her creation of the runewells. After the death of Xin in -6420, tensions between the 7 Runelords began to ratchet up quickly. Like I mentioned in my previous videos, the Runelords rejected the diplomatic mission from Aslant in -6410, contributing to an increase in hostilities between the two superpowers. Xandergul's continued weaponization of the faith of the Peacock Spirit made it clear that he was making a play for Xin's authority, and Runelord Tanaris took things a step further by forging the first of the Alata High. Not to be outdone, Sorshen quickly responded by forging a mighty sword of her own. The Sword of Lust was the first of the Swords of Sin to have been forged at the Rune Forge, meaning it was the second ever created after Tanaris. Sorshen's enchanters initially created the sword in -6347 AR, just 8 years after the Rune Forge was founded. They presented their creation, a beautiful longsword whose grip took the form of a pair of embracing nude lovers, soon after. The Runelord of Lust immediately took the blade to her harem, where she plunged it into the body of one of her many servants. Some legends claim that this person was the sword's original intended champion, while others claim they were merely Sorshen's least favored consort. In the shocked silence which followed, Sorshen declared that anyone who could bring the cleaned blade back to her bedchamber would be named her champion and become the most favored of her servants. As Sorshen departed for her chambers to reward her eventual champion, the screams and cries of battle roared to life in her wake. After a fearsome and terrible fight, the swordswoman Ashaya, a stranger from a far-off land, stepped into Sorshen's bedchamber, gleaming sword in hand. The two women emerged from the chamber days later, a runelord and her most devoted and favored servant. Ashaya served for many years before eventually being struck down, at which point Sorshen bestowed the sword with her name. Unlike the other swords of sin, it's not entirely clear if the sword is actually instilled with the consciousness of its first bearer. It is certainly sentient, but the source of this mind could very well be someone other than the original Ashaya. Mechanically, Ashaya is a +5 flaming longsword, which burns with blue flame. The sword renders its wielder entirely immune to all forms of enchantment magic, which probably manifests in 2e as an immunity to mental or emotion effects. Foes hit with a strike from Ashaya need to succeed at a DC 20 will save, or be subjected to a charm spell, while foes who are critically hit run the risk of being hit by a dominate spell. Compared to the other swords of sin, I actually find Ashaya to be the most interesting. It isn't especially powerful mechanically, since the will save DC for its most powerful ability is fairly low for high-level creatures. Its most powerful effect, the immunity to enchantments, is absolutely bizarre, since it makes the Champion of Lust completely immune to Sorshen's direct control. This might indicate a desire on Sorshen's part to place some kind of check on her own power, though this is unclear. Alternatively, she might have wanted a servant who she couldn't control directly, but instead needed to manipulate emotionally, so she could guarantee that servant's loyalty if they ever came across a more powerful enchanter. The Rule of Sorshen. As the head of state of Eurythnia, Sorshen's reign was defined in large part by 4 key aspects: her academic tendencies, her religious faith, her grand construction projects, and her carefully calculated neutrality on the world stage. Sorshen was, despite her reputation for capriciousness and perversion, a truly accomplished academic. She is definitely the most scholarly minded of the Runelords I've discussed, and ample evidence exists to speak to her technical understanding of arcane magic, as well as the skill with which she communicated it to her students and apprentices. She was known to lecture to entire classrooms of students on the art of enchantment magic, and even constructed lecture halls within the Lady's Light for such a purpose. Beyond the topic of enchantment, Sorshen was also fascinated with both alchemy and conjuration, and she had multiple laboratories established throughout her kingdom devoted to each of the arts. Sorshen possessed a particular fascination with extraplanar creatures who possessed innate enchantment magic. Famously, her researchers at the Runeforge worked closely with succubi to expand their understanding of enchantment and the ways it overlapped with the sin of lust. Additionally, Sorshen was fascinated with the Swegathi, fiends from the depths of the outer rifts, who possessed the ability to drive their victims insane, then command these victims after their minds had been broken. These creatures, along with other extraplanar enchanters, were often summoned by Sorshen or her apprentices, then bound to the material plane so they might be studied at length. Sorshen's experimentation was not limited to summoned creatures, however. She frequently refined new methods of enchantment upon mortals who were bound within her laboratories. Some of these test subjects were willing, but these were very much in the minority. More often, unwilling subjects were restrained and forced to endure the Runelord's experimentation while remaining entirely still. In addition to the many magic items and artifacts which Sorshen created, she is also credited with the creation of several arcane texts detailing her studies and findings. She is the author of the article on rune magic, which was printed in the Secrets of Magic sourcebook, for instance. Another text, called From the Minds of Monsters, was also written by her, and is an exhaustive examination of numerous creatures on Golarion which display innate enchantment abilities. A third text, titled Dreams and Desires, which explores the connection between enchantment magic and the very real power of dreams, may have been written by or contributed to by Sorshen, though that is unclear. Unlike her academic tendencies, which were relatively consistent throughout her career, Sorshen's religious faith was much more fickle. By her own admission, Sorshen was not an especially religious person early on in her reign. She saw little point in sincere religious devotion, and considered faith to be a tool, something to be employed when it was useful, but set aside soon after. She was the only Runelord at the time who didn't contribute to the construction of Xandergul's Grand Temple of the Peacock Spirit, seeing it as a foolish endeavor. During her early years, Sorshen practiced the faiths of a number of deities, offering prayers to whatever deities had influence over the works she was trying to accomplish. Her devotion was never lasting, however, and she quickly dropped her religious practices as soon as she had accomplished whatever goal had necessitated the gods' help in the first place. This all changed, however, sometime after the construction of the Lady's Light. This facility employed and studied a large number of powerful, lustful outsiders, namely succubi and incubi. To acquire these demons, Sorshen entered into a bargain with Nocticula, the Lady in Shadow, who was the lord of the succubi. In return for the construction of a shrine and a regular offering of sacrifices, Nocticula provided Sorshen with the demons she needed to power her experimentation. While at first glance this relationship appeared as transactional as any other religious activity in which Sorshen had engaged, the faith of Nocticula appears to have had a far greater hold over Sorshen than any other faith she'd tried. Sorshen would maintain this faith in secret for much of the rest of her reign, and she held the faith of Nocticula close, even as she entered her personal demiplane to escape the Earthfall calamity. That said, Sorshen was no evangelist. She took care to construct her shrine to Nocticula in a hidden chamber within the Lady's Light, so none of her servants might become distracted by Nocticula's many enchanting features. Regardless of any faith she might have felt, Sorshen was the only one who would hold power in Eurythnia. Speaking of the Lady's Light, this was the premier example of Sorshen's large-scale construction projects. Unlike the other Runelords, most of Sorshen's great works depicted her entire form, displaying her whole body either in the nude or in revealing clothing intended to accentuate her incredible beauty. The only known examples of this, which still exist in the Age of Lost Omens, are the Lady's Light on the Varisian coast, the Gatefoot in Korvosa, and the Sunken Queen Pyramid in the Mushfens, but the lore makes it clear that many other such constructions existed across Eurythnia. The Lady's Light was an enormous statue standing nearly 200 feet tall. It depicted Sorshen draped in flowing silks, with one arm raised high. In her hand, a magical blue flame burned for eternity, and this light was visible for miles in all directions, allowing all to gaze upon Sorshen's beauty, be it day or night. Located near the border with both Shalast and Bakrakhan, this monument served to remind all who saw it of the true power in the south, the undefeated Runelord of Lust. In addition to serving as a monument, this structure was partially hollow, and contained within it many halls, chambers, and secret rooms dedicated to magical research, arcane instruction, and numerous other functions. When she needed to visit the western portion of her kingdom, Sorshen used the Lady's Light as a home away from home, and it contained various chambers which provided her with all the comforts of a palace. She could study, hold court, rest, and host dignitaries within the structure. She also used the facility as a treasure vault, within which she could store some of her most valuable possessions. It was the Lady's Light which Sorshen eventually chose as the home for her Sihedron Shard of Lust, and there it remained undisturbed for millennia. When Sorshen herself was not residing in the Lady's Light, she made use of the powerful succubus Ayanda Mala, who served as her major domo, and who had been given as a gift by Nocticula. Despite the display of power which the Lady's Light was intended to proclaim, Sorshen rarely took an openly aggressive stance regarding her fellow Runelords. Like I mentioned earlier, she employed a more defensive strategy when dealing with her peers, and almost never involved herself directly in their affairs. That's not to say that she never took action, however, as Sorshen was known to make careful and frequent use of proxies and middlemen to accomplish her goals and covertly undermine the efforts of the other Runelords. Because of the skill with which she used these proxies, it seems safe to assume that Sorshen likely had at least a small, undisclosed part to play in many of the triumphs and tribulations which I've discussed throughout this series, or, at the very least, was aware of many of them as they were happening. Despite this more reserved approach to intervention, there is one instance in which Sorshen took direct confrontational action against a fellow Runelord. Fairly late into her rule, Sorshen decided that Zutha, the final Runelord of Gluttony, needed to go. It's unclear what Zutha did to draw Sorshen's anger, though I suspect it had something to do with his construction of the black squares of Ungevik within the borders of Eurythnia. Regardless, Sorshen put her mind to the task, and quickly developed a means of hitting Zutha where he was most vulnerable: his soul cage. By this point in history, Zutha had already split the gluttonous tome into its 3 component parts, and he assumed that they were functionally impervious to harm, unless they were brought back together. Sorshen, though, discovered a method by which she could draw out the portion of Zutha's soul contained within one of the 3 subcomponents, then destroy that soul fragment. This would be enough to destroy Zutha entirely, as his full self would never be able to be restored with a third of his soul missing. Sorshen called the magic required to accomplish this feat the Rune-Waking Ritual. It required her to channel the power of the long-abandoned 7 Virtues of Rule, which Zin had held so dear, powers which had been largely abandoned all across Thassilon. A few small pockets of this gathered power remained, however, and Sorshen knew of one location, on the Isle of Zin, within the abandoned capital city. With this power in her grasp, Sorshen would be able to manifest a weak simulacrum of Zutha into a body made from the energies of the Shadow Plane. This form would be maintained for a single minute, during which time it could be killed, and Zutha's soul would be sent on its way to Pharasma for judgment. Unfortunately, Sorshen never got the chance to put this ritual to use. The Earthfall calamity arrived before she could confront the Lord of Gluttony and destroy him once and for all. This careful approach to Zutha's destruction is an excellent example of Sorshen's cautiousness. Despite the obvious and demonstrable power gap between her and Zutha, she was unwilling to face him in open conflict. Such a risk was unnecessary, and cleverness and subtlety were far more reliable and effective. I don't doubt that Sorshen could have easily defeated Zutha in a straight-up fight, but the fact that she ensured that no such contest was even necessary is what makes Sorshen such an incredibly dangerous character. It's this precise application of power which made Sorshen so powerful, and likely what made Xandergul consider her the only rival he ever had among the Runelords. The other works of Sorshen. Due to Sorshen's natural talent for academics and magical research, she and her apprentices are credited with the creation of many spells, rituals, magic items, and artifacts beyond those I've already discussed. The unconscious agenda spell is one such effect, and is likely one of the tools which Sorshen used to place so many agents around Thassilon. This 6th rank spell allowed a caster to implant a command into the target's mind, then allowed the caster to specify a condition upon which that command was to be carried out. These commands and conditions were limited to 20 words each. The target was allowed a single save at the time of casting, but if they failed, the spell would remain in effect for potentially months at a time. The real danger of this spell was the effort required to detect and remove it. Dispel Magic had no effect on this spell, and only spells like Mage's Disjunction, Limited Wish, or Wish could effectively dispel the effect. At the same time, Detect Magic could not reliably identify the spell, since it would only be detectable to casters more powerful than the original caster. And I should remind you that no one was more powerful than Sorshen, meaning this spell was functionally undetectable. A less subtle tool, which Sorshen and her students developed, was the Sadist's Lash, a magical whip made of woven black leather and silver wire, capable of causing bleed damage in its targets. The whip acted as a conduit for enchantment magic, and wielders could treat the whip as an extension of themselves, allowing them to target enemies up to 10 feet away with touch-based enchantment effects. Any target who took damage from the Sadist's Lash needed to succeed at a DC 15 will save, or suffer a steep penalty to their saves against enchantment spells for 1 minute. Sorshen had a particular fondness for the creation of magical clothing. One example of this, which she herself employed, was the Dance of the Seven Veils, a magical scarf which she was known to hand out to her various blood simulacra as they enacted her will throughout the kingdom. This beautiful scarlet silk scarf granted the wearer access to the Disguise Self spell, and also increased the wearer's skill at both deception and diplomacy. It also allowed the wearer to levitate at will. Another item of magical clothing attributed to Sorshen is the Scintillating Garment. There are actually 2 items which bear this name, but I'm currently talking about the weaker one. This item took the form of a stylish outfit made from a combination of mist and thin overlapping layers of silk. Though the garment could shift its appearance to that of any style of tight-fitting dress or tunic, it always appeared nearly transparent, allowing the onlookers to catch unclear glimpses of the wearer's skin. If the wearer succeeded at a diplomacy check while wearing the garment, they could select a single target of that check, and the garment would effectively increase the degree of success of that check by 1, assuming the target failed the will save. This would allow a successful check to make the target outright helpful, rather than just friendly. The more powerful of the 2 items called a Scintillating Garment was Runelord Sorshen's own personal set of magical robes. Sorshen developed this item as an evolution of the Robe of Scintillating Colors. Sorshen's robes retained the ability of that item to create an aura of concealment and dazing magical power, but also imbued her with additional powers. The robes granted Sorshen a huge bonus to AC, and empowered her spellcasting as though she were 1 level higher than she actually were. They also granted her resistance to magical attacks, and substantial bonuses to all her saving throws. The robes also functioned as an unbelievably powerful Apex magic item, boosting all 6 of her ability scores. They also contained several bags of holding within the pockets. As the original creator of a runewell, Sorshen also can be credited with the creation of the Runewell Amulet, a powerful item which greatly increased her physical defenses, granted her fast healing, and allowed her to fly with a speed of 60 feet. It also acted as another source of immortality, since it directly connected her to her Runelord of Lust. As long as the Runewell was active, she did not need to eat or drink, and her body did not age. So that makes 3 sources of immortality in total, 1 from the amulet, 1 from the Everdawn pool, and 1 from being a high-tier mythic character. One of the most powerful items Sorshen ever developed, at least discounting the Runewells, was a large mirror, simply dubbed the Mirror of Sorshen. This mirror appears to have stood several feet tall, and its wooden frame was carved with the beautiful nude figures of a man on one side and a woman on the other. Any who looked upon the lens of the mirror, even if only for a moment, saw within it an image of some object of their desire. This object was specific to each individual, and could range from a pile of gold, to a throne, to a person. Most often, the object was someone who the viewer found irresistibly arousing. Upon seeing this image, the viewer needed to make a DC 27 will save, and failure resulted in the viewer becoming fascinated. This fascinated condition lasted until after the mirror was removed from the viewer's sight. Once viewers were fascinated, the owner of the mirror could choose to activate the artifact's magic, taking control of all those which the object had fascinated as per the Dominate spell. This domination lasted for 30 days, but could be automatically extended by showing the mirror to the victim again before the time expired. Sorshen made regular use of this mirror to ensure that she always had a steady supply of workers for her large building projects, though I don't doubt that such a powerful device had plenty of other uses for one so clever as her. Disturbingly, the Mirror of Sorshen was imbued with a level of intelligence of its own, a fact which even Sorshen was unaware of until long after the mirror's creation. The goals and motivations of the mirror are unclear, but in the absence of a master as powerful as Sorshen, it is likely to betray all those who attempt to wield it. Though whether these wielders will ever even notice the betrayal is unclear. Like the other Runelords, Sorshen also made her own attempts at the creation and refinement of living magical creatures. Rather than relying on flesh warping or necromancy, however, Sorshen approached her efforts by attempting to combine two living beings into one. The most prominent result of these efforts was the Hallowed Lynx. Hallowed Lynxes were created by summoning shining children from the depths of the multiverse, then binding them within the body of a living sphinx. The shining child continued to live on as an orbiting mote of light around the lynx's body, though it lacked the ability to take action without the direction of its feline host. The lynx itself absorbed a small amount of the shining child's intellect, becoming intelligent and sentient. It gained the ability to learn speech, though not the ability to speak on its own, and also gained arcane sight. The hallowed lynxes could follow complex commands, and could direct the motes of light around them to shed bright light, or even blind their enemies. The lynxes could even command the lights around them to manifest as shining children, and fight on the lynx's behalf, though each light could only do this once per day. As level 17 creatures, hallowed lynxes were exceptionally powerful. Sorshen originally created them to serve as companions and pets, and to act as her loyal guards when humanoids couldn't be trusted. The creatures were so effective, however, that they soon became fairly popular throughout Eurythnia, and powerful mages throughout the kingdom soon employed them as guardians and assistants. Still, they were difficult to create, and only a few hundred were ever successfully produced. After the Earthfall calamity, most of the hallowed lynxes were destroyed. A rare few were preserved in Sorshen's efforts to escape the disaster, however, and a few others escaped into the wilds of Varisia. That said, none have been sighted in the wild in thousands of years. Finally, I should discuss a favored ritual employed frequently by Sorshen. The Runelord manifestation technique was a powerful occult ritual which allowed Sorshen, and the other Runelords, to project an image of themselves into the sky above a distant location. This image functioned as the focal point for a scrying effect, allowing the Runelord to take in all that the eyes of the projected image would be able to see, as though the eyes of the image were real. The image could also project the voice of the Runelord at an incredible volume, allowing them to be heard by those below. Certain spells, like Detect Thoughts and Detect Magic, could be cast through the projected image with ease, though other spells required a concentration check to be cast successfully. Sorshen was known to make use of this effect regularly, as it both allowed her to communicate with her subjects and agents from the safety of her own palace, and allowed her to display her beauty and grace to even those far away. However, Sorshen's affection for this ritual ended abruptly at an unspecified date late into her rule. An enemy spellcaster somehow reverse-engineered the ritual, and was able to trace the magical tether from the projected image all the way back to Sorshen herself. This caster then attacked Sorshen in her palace, forcing Sorshen to cut the ritual off and sever the connection. After that day, she rarely used the technique again. While the identity of this mysterious figure has never been revealed, my first guess is, of course, Xandergul. Among the 7 Runelords, only he was greater than Sorshen in power, and the Runelord manifestation ritual functioned very similarly to an illusion, and no one understood illusions better than Xandergul. That said, I can't prove this, and it's just as compelling to think that some other mysterious power was working behind the scenes to undermine Sorshen. Sorshen's plans to survive Earthfall. As the Earthfall calamity approached, Sorshen, like the other Runelords, became aware of the impending disaster. Having long ago developed her major Runewell of Lust, and having specifically planned to use the Eye of Desire demiplane to avoid large-scale disasters, Sorshen was about as well prepared as she could have been to face the oncoming apocalypse. To release her from her self-imposed interplanar exile, Sorshen developed the Blood Engines of Eurythnia, a series of powerful magitech machines which siphoned blood from a wide variety of powerful magical creatures. These creatures had been captured and collected by Sorshen's agents over many years, and were kept in an opulent menagerie. The blood engines were located beneath the Grand Mastaba in Zin Eurythnia, though it's unclear if the menagerie was hidden there as well. These blood engines would channel the magic-infused blood of these creatures into the crystalline heart of the structure, a solidified, multifaceted mass of blood drawn directly from the Everdawn pool. This heart would then gather enough energy to release Sorshen from the Eye of Desire, but only after it detected that the dangers of Earthfall were past. To guard her resting place, Sorshen had bound numerous fiends from the outer spheres, and had built many powerful constructs of a variety of designs. She also employed a cabal of powerful vampires as her last line of defense. She had long been fascinated by vampires, despite her inability to cast necromantic spells. She saw in them a lot of untapped potential, especially for the ways their addiction to blood might interact with the Everdawn pool, and the ways in which many vampires employed their innate enchantment magic to ensnare their victims. Of course, Sorshen hadn't risen to power by simply throwing all her eggs into one basket. Having a backup plan was second nature to her by this point in her rule. Though she would be unable to create or control the blood simulacra which had served her so well throughout her time on the throne, Sorshen did succeed in creating the next best thing. She created numerous clones of herself, and placed them in hidden and secure locations throughout her kingdom. Any of these was a perfect replica of Sorshen's own body, though they lacked a soul and were not truly alive. If Sorshen were to die, she could simply awaken within one of these new bodies, any one of which would serve her just as well as the original. And so, on the eve of Earthfall, Sorshen retreated within the Eye of Desire, confident that she would re-emerge within a few decades and resume her rule without issue. Unfortunately for her, the Earthfall calamity would be far more destructive than she or any of the Runelords could have possibly predicted. For players looking to build characters devoted to the sin of lust, the virtue of love, or the School of Enchantment more broadly, here are some ideas. Common personal edicts among practitioners of lust might include to shamelessly indulge in the pleasures of the flesh, to manipulate others using your personal charm, and to separate physical attraction from emotional connection. Conversely, common personal edicts among practitioners of love might include to respect and support loving relationships, to see beauty beyond mere physical appearance, and to respect the autonomy of those you hold dear. For those using the alignment rules, those engaging in the sin of lust will tend toward evil alignments, while those practicing the virtue of love will tend toward good. For characters who wield weapons in combat, the Gisarm and the longsword might be associated with lust or enchantment, as they were the weapon types for the Alara Keen and Alara High of lust. Other weapons with a thematic connection might include the glaive or the whip, for their religious connections to Shelyn and Calistria. Any weapon which deals non-lethal damage might appeal to a particularly sadistic practitioner of lust who seeks gratification by causing pain in others. The following property runes have a connection to enchantment magic: the Hopeful property rune, which can bolster allies, and the Nightmare property rune, which can cause fear in enemies. Characters emphasizing their connection to the School of Enchantment will most commonly dress in red, as that was the color associated with both lust and love in Thassilonian culture. Sorshen herself commonly accented her red clothing with purples and lavenders, but pale blues and soft pinks were sometimes seen as representative of enchantment as well. Characters indulging in the sin of lust might choose to embrace a more sultry appearance, using exposed skin, tight-fitting garments, or suggestive makeup to accentuate their more alluring features. Characters practicing the virtue of love, however, will likely dress in softer, more welcoming ensembles, intended to set those around them at ease. There are a wide variety of deities which might appeal to characters who are drawn to either love or lust. On the love side of the equation, you have Shelyn as the most obvious choice, though deities like Bolka, Arshay, Nalinivati, and even Naderi have a strong connection to the concept of love. Some characters might even connect Shizuru and Skio to the concept of love, even though neither of them individually consider it one of their primary areas of concern. On the lustful side of the equation, the most obvious choice is, of course, Calistria, though other deities like Ardad Lili, Belial, Sokoth-Benoth, and Nocticula's former assistant Shamira are all equally applicable. Interestingly, Arshe and Limneris are both good-aligned deities who still have an association with lust and carnal activities. Most of these deities also have a more general connection to the School of Enchantment, for characters who are less interested in sins and virtues. From a class perspective, numerous classes can make use of enchantment magic to shine both on and off the battlefield. Enchanter wizards are extremely powerful, even in the post-remaster age, and the School of Mentalism is a solid pick for characters wishing to specialize in mental manipulation. Fae and Nymph bloodline sorcerers also have a strong connection to enchantment magic, as do Fae Eidolon summoners. Clerics of appropriate deities will serve well too, though the divine spell list often lacks a lot of the classic enchantment spells. Of course, few classes have a stronger connection to enchantment than the Bard, and their natural charisma lends itself toward the social manipulation for which enchanters are so often known. That being said, I should also mention the impressive powers of the Silent Whisper Psychic, which has a strong connection to the School of Enchantment, and could also be charisma-based, depending on your choice of subconscious mind. If I was going to pick a non-wizard class to represent a Runelord of Lust or Love, I would be hard-pressed to pick something other than a Bard or a Silent Whisper Psychic. For the martial classes, true enchantment-based abilities are a bit harder to come by. The obedience and redemption causes for the champion both provide reactions which might very easily be interpreted as an enchantment effect, and which are fairly powerful. Pistolero gunslingers might interpret their Raconteur's Reload and Grim Swagger abilities as a manifestation of some innate enchantment magic. And the same might be said for the panache-generating abilities of the Battle Dancer, Braggart, or Wit-style swashbucklers. Thaumaturges might see the Regalia implement as having a strong connection to enchantment. Looking at pets, characters who employ familiars might gravitate toward cobras, as their hypnotic powers have often been associated with enchantment magic. Similarly, a lynx might be an excellent choice of animal companion, especially if the character suspects that this particular lynx might be a descendant of one of Sorshen's beloved hallowed lynxes. And, before I close out my discussion of classes, I would be remiss if I didn't address one particular class's connection to the sin of lust. For as long as tabletop RPGs have existed, the horny bard stereotype has existed with them. It's a character type nearly as old as the game itself. But, in this modern day, I feel like we really need to move on from such a tired and played-out trope. If you're creating your character and you want to play a horny bard, I want you to think for a moment. Is that really the character you want to play? Will that really help you feel original? Hasn't tabletop gaming as a hobby grown enough to put aside such childish stereotypes? I believe in you as players. You can do better than just another horny bard. Any character of any class can be horny. All you have to do is believe in yourself. Relatively few ancestries have an innate connection to enchantment magic. The Siren Song Merfolk ability and the Fox Possession Kitsune ability are both related to enchantment effects, but these are the only effects these ancestries have that touch on enchantment. Nagaji actually have quite a few options which connect them to enchantment, through their hypnotic gaze feats and the innate magic to which they have access. Dhampirs can access some of the natural charm of their ancestors through the enthralling allure feat. The most common ancestry in Eurythnia was human, though the prominence of elves within the nation's pleasure houses likely led to a high concentration of Ayuvarans as well. In classical Varisian hero tradition, the cards the Joke and the Rakshasa were commonly seen as having a strong connection to the School of Enchantment. Astrologers, meanwhile, generally interpret the moon as being the celestial representative of enchantment magic. For GMs looking to incorporate the School of Enchantment, the Runelord of Lust, or the nation of Eurythnia into a campaign, here are a few more ideas. One location on the ancient Thassilon map which I have yet to discuss is Ygrath's Pier, located here on the southwestern coast of Eurythnia. This location has never been mentioned outside of this map to my knowledge, and appears to be a massive trading post. A stone pier extends out into the sea for a distance of more than a mile, even accounting for the tendency of the map to exaggerate the dimensions of major landmarks. This location likely serves as the most prosperous merchant city in all of Eurythnia, at least based solely on its position. It would have dominated both north-south and east-west trade routes in the region, making it probably the busiest port in all of Thassilon by a wide margin. Unfortunately, the location of Ygrath's Pier has been lost to time, as it sank into the sea during the Earthfall calamity. It might make for a tempting archaeological site if ever discovered, and GMs could certainly use the opportunity to allow players to make use of the many underwater ancestries which Pathfinder offers. As enemies for such a campaign, I might suggest the undead remains of some ancient Sawajin pirates, or the marsh giant guards who likely would have fought over this location and the ships which approached it. The many secret agents which Sorshen placed throughout the Thassilonian Empire present an interesting potential plot hook for GMs. Sorshen loyalists, knowing or otherwise, might have contributed to any number of successes or failures on the part of the other Runelords. This might allow GMs to place these agents, or at least their remains, throughout Thassilonian ruins all across modern Varissia. It might make for a fun campaign if players are tasked with unraveling an ancient international conspiracy, which Sorshen set into motion through her agents. This could allow players to explore a wide variety of Thassilonian locations while also following a cohesive, if exceptionally well-hidden, narrative. Finally, now that I've discussed all 7 of the Swords of Sin in detail, I would like to suggest a potentially unconventional villain for a Varissian campaign. Depending on how the Swords of Sin are ported over to 2E, the best wielder of them might end up being a Thaumaturge. The Intensify Investiture feat could allow a Thaumaturge to set the save DC for the Swords of Sin higher than the weapon's base DC, making the weapon's effects far more dangerous. This would, however, require the abilities of these weapons to be updated to function as activated effects, though this could easily be implemented as part of homebrewing them over to 2E. Such a character might make for an exceptionally compelling villain in the Age of Lost Omens, assuming he or she could find some way to activate the swords even with many of the Runelords having been defeated. If this character had some method of bypassing the drive of these weapons to loyally serve their Runelord master, possibly by having a pair of those Runeguard gauntlets which I discussed a few videos ago, then this character might even want to collect the swords in their dormant state, then help new Runelords rise to power, specifically so the swords might reawaken to their full strength. And this, finally, marks the end of my discussion of the Sin of Lust, and the completion of my discussion of the 7 Sins of Thassilon. I saved Sorshen for last because she and her legacy are the most compelling of the Runelords, at least in my opinion. And she and her machinations are set up to play a major role in the ongoing story of the Runelords in the Age of Lost Omens. With the conclusion of this video, the 12 days of Sinmas are, at long last, drawing to a close. I've covered each of the 39 Runelords of Thassilon in as much detail as I possibly could, and frankly, I'm running out of things to say. But if I'm being entirely honest, the story isn't yet complete. I've ended all my coverage up to this point on the eve of Earthfall, with the Runelords going into hiding to weather the coming storm. But all these best-laid plans were about to come crumbling down. In the final episode of this series, I'll be discussing the complete collapse of the Thassilonian Empire as a result of the Earthfall calamity. This epilogue video will not be coming out tomorrow. I am way too busy to pull that off, and this series of 12 videos in a row was already a Herculean effort. I'll be back in a week or two with my closing thoughts. Until then, thank you for watching and sticking with this series the whole way through. I'll see you again soon.